Cambridge, 1930. A narrow-shouldered man in a dark three-piece suit stands at a lectern, clears his throat, and offers a number that sounds almost indecently small. 15. 15 hours a week? That, he says, is all your grandchildren will need to work. No one laughs him out of the room. They don't need to. The claim is too precise, too calmly reasoned, too mathematically disciplined to dismiss as fantasy. Nearly a century later, the arithmetic still holds up under inspection. The number never arrived. The man is John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most consequential economist of the 20th century. And in that same year, he publishes an essay with a title so gentle it could be mistaken for reassurance: Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Its logic is almost austere in its simplicity. If productivity compounds year after year through machinery, electrification, logistics, management, and science, then the old constraint that governed human life for millennia begins to dissolve. The economic problem, as Keynes called it, was never philosophical. It was material: not enough food, not enough shelter, not enough labor-saving power. Solve scarcity, and labor time collapses. 3 hours a day. The rest of the day returned to living. That is the question this series intends to press until it gives way. If the tools arrived, if productivity materialized, if the forecast's core mathematics was fundamentally sound, where did the liberated hours go? What makes Keynes unsettling is not that he missed, it's how long he appeared to be exactly right. In 1930, the average American worked about 47 hours per week. Annual hours stood at roughly 2,316. By any contemporary standard, it was brutal. Long factory shifts, physical domestic labor, clerical work done by hand, recovery time treated as expendable. Keynes looked at mechanization curves and output data, projected forward, and drew a line that sloped downward with confidence. For decades, reality followed it. By the 1970s, the average work week had dropped to around 39 hours. That reduction sounds modest when compressed into a sentence, but socially it was enormous. In one historical sweep, an entire working day per week was clawed back from necessity. Washing machines erased hours of scrubbing and wringing. Refrigeration transformed shopping rhythms and food storage. Assembly lines increased output per worker. Better transport shrank distribution friction. Office equipment compressed communication cycles that had once consumed days. Each breakthrough performed the same trick: more output from less human effort per unit. The denominator was shrinking, exactly as promised. Economists noticed. Policymakers noticed. Cultural commentators began preparing for a leisure society, not as utopian fiction, but as a practical horizon. The debate wasn't whether short work weeks would come. The debate was what people would do with their surplus time, how education, civic life, family structures, and even identity might reorganize around abundance. Very few people prepared for the line to stop falling. Then it did. Not elegantly, not as a soft tapering of progress, it flattened into structure. By the mid-1970s, the American workweek settled near 40 hours, and, despite technological revolutions that remade everything from manufacturing to communication to finance, has refused to decline with any durable conviction for roughly 50 years. Yes, annual hours fell from 2,316 in 1929 to about 1,765 by 2019. A real reduction, roughly 23.8%. Significant if viewed in isolation. But Keynes's implied endpoint was not somewhat better. It was transformation. A 15-hour week translates to around 780 hours of labor per year. In 2019, Americans worked more than double that. This is not a forecasting rounding error. It is a structural gap of roughly 1,000 hours per person per year, hours that rising productivity should have made optional, then did not. And this is where the paradox hardens. Leisure stalled. Productivity did not. output per worker kept climbing through late 20th century globalization, through software diffusion, through personal computing, through the internet, through the smartphone epoch, through the first commercial wave of AI. The engines Keynes counted on, technology, capital deepening, organizational efficiency, continued delivering. The conversion pipeline changed. Gains that once translated into shorter schedules began translating into other things. Higher aggregate output, larger consumption baselines, faster competitive cycles, denser expectations, and a quiet expansion of obligations marketed as freedom. Economists sometimes describe this as a lost, saved time dynamic. Every major efficiency wave arrives wrapped in a liberation story. The steam engine reduces toil. Electricity lightens domestic burden. Office software removes drudgery. Mobile computing grants flexibility. AI handles routine cognition. Then the same sequence repeats. Time is saved, then reabsorbed. Not stolen in one dramatic act, reallocated in increments too small to trigger alarm. Nowhere is this clearer than the smartphone. It entered public life in the 2000s as convenience condensed, instant communication, searchable knowledge, navigation, remote coordination, frictionless transactions. It delivered all of that, and then, almost imperceptibly, it dissolved the boundary that used to protect off hours. The office did not disappear. It atomized and followed people home, into transit, into meals, into the final hour before sleep. The device that promised mobility also normalized permanent reachability. So Keynes's 15-hour week is not mainly a story about mistaken inputs. His trend assumptions were disciplined. His model of compounding productive capacity was, in the broad sense, vindicated. What he underestimated was the adaptive appetite of surrounding systems, institutions, markets, managerial norms, and status competitions that learned to capture each newly available minute before it stabilized as rest. The productivity dividend existed. It was claimed before most people could experience it as leisure. To understand how that capture happened, we need three mechanisms. The first is old, almost mechanical. Improved efficiency often lowers effective cost, which can increase total demand enough to erase the expected savings. A 19th century observation from coal economics now applied to human time. The second is newer and more intimate. Attention itself became extractable, quantifiable, and tradable. Idle moments were converted into inventory. The third is cultural and harder to measure. A shift so thorough that enough ceased to function as a social stopping rule. More became not an ambition, but a default setting. If you already have a candidate for the dominant mechanism, hold it lightly. The obvious answer is not always the operative one. We begin with coal, and with William Stanley Jevons, who noticed a pattern that still governs modern life. Efficiency does not necessarily reduce demand. Quite often, it feeds it. In 1865, 29-year-old English economist William Stanley Jevons published The Coal Question, a title so dry it could have been filed beside invoices. Inside it sat one brutal observation. Britain's steam engines had grown far more efficient over previous decades, burning less coal per unit of work. So one might expect coal use to fall. It rose instead. Efficiency made coal-powered industry cheaper, cheaper made it profitable in places once untouched, profitable made new engines worth building, and every new engine demanded more coal. The resource was consumed faster precisely because each unit was being used with greater prudence. Jevons called it paradox. Later economists named it after him. Everyone else lived inside it without bothering to ask why the walls kept closing in. Coal is not point. Grammar is. When system lowers cost of consuming resource, demand does not shrink, it swells, then hardens into habit. Replace coal with human time, and sentence still holds. Cleanly, uncomfortably. Take office letter. Mid-20th century clerk might draft 4 or 5 business messages daily, each one passing through dictation, typing, review, envelope, stamp, and postal delay. The process was slow enough to police itself. Email arrived and stripped away nearly every friction point, collapsing composition into minutes and delivery into seconds. Did correspondence decline in proportion to speed gained? No. Average office worker now receives 121 emails per day. Efficiency did not free worker from correspondence. It erased ceiling on how much correspondence could be demanded before lunch. This is not metaphor for Jevons paradox. It is Jevons paradox, translated from anthracite into attention. Each technological generation enters wearing same costume, liberator. Industrial revolution, mechanized tasks, once eating entire lifetimes in repetitive strain. Electrification and domestic appliances, washing machine, vacuum, refrigerator, were sold as instruments of temporal emancipation, especially for women whose unpaid labor had vanished into economic fog. Office computing in 1980s promised paperless workflow and streamlined administration. Smartphone, introduced in early 2000s, arrived as pocket-sized convenience engine, instant communication, boundless information, office untethered from geography, all with a glass face and bright, narcotic glow. Script never varies, outcome never obeys. What follows is consistent, almost monotonous in its cunning. First, technology cuts time required for existing tasks. Second, lower time reduces perceived cost of asking for that task. Third, volume expands to absorb, then exceed, time supposedly saved. Fourth, new volume becomes baseline expectation. Fifth, anyone still operating at old volume looks inefficient, even lazy, which is how machinery teaches guilt to speak. By 1970s, average weekly hours had fallen to around 39, tracking, imperfectly but visibly, toward Keynes's projection. Then curve flattened as if pinned under glass. For next half-century, despite most explosive era of technological innovation in human history, American workweek hovered stubbornly around 40 hours. Annual working hours did fall from 2,316 in 1929 to 1,765 in 2019, a reduction of roughly 24%. Keynes had imagined something closer to 70%. That gap is not rounding error, it is policy-wearing costume of inevitability. So where did surplus go? Not into leisure, into throughput. Faster tools meant tighter deadlines, wider project scopes, leaner teams expected to produce more per capita, messaging platforms removed communication lag, then installed implicit duty of instant reply. Remote work infrastructure dissolved commute, then dissolved boundary between office and bedroom. Every wall removed revealed not freedom, but another corridor. Pattern is too uniform to be accident. Time-saving technology does not enter vacuum. It enters institutions built on expansion, competition, and quarterly legibility. Inside such systems, freed capacity is not gift to worker, it is signal to manager. Idle capacity, in language of operational efficiency, is waste. Waste, in language of shareholder value, is negligence. That is where the rot becomes policy. This shifts explanation away from technological determinism and toward institutional incentive. Tools themselves are agnostic. A spreadsheet does not care whether it accelerates report or accelerates a human toward exhaustion. Deciding variable is reward structure surrounding tool. And since 1970s, that structure has overwhelmingly rewarded output volume over temporal autonomy. Keynes's projection was numerically plausible under one assumption he never examined closely enough: that societies, once productive enough, would choose to convert surplus capacity into rest. Post-1970 economy chose different conversion. Gains flowed into growth targets, consumption escalation, professional credentialism. Dividend existed. It was simply reinvested into more. But workload expansion is only half ledger. Deeper mutation came when economy discovered even hours people were not working contained extractable value, that attention itself could be metered, packaged, and sold. And then, the smartphone arrived in the early 2000s, wrapped in the language of freedom. Advertisements showed professionals on beaches, laptops balanced on driftwood, the implicit promise that a device small enough to slip into a pocket could dissolve the architecture of the office itself. What no advertisement mentioned, what no product launch ever mentions, is that a tool which lets you work from anywhere also lets work follow you everywhere. The distinction between these two propositions is the entire story of modern exhaustion. For most of industrial history, capital extracted value from bodies in scheduled blocks. A factory whistle marked the beginning. Another marked the end. Between those signals, your attention belonged to the employer. Outside them, it belonged, at least nominally, to you. This boundary was imperfect, often violated, but it existed as a structural fact. Clocks enforced it. Walls reinforced it. The commute home was not merely transit, it was decompression, the physical distance that allowed the mind to shift registers. The digital economy dismantled that boundary not through coercion, but through convenience. Earlier advertising operated on a broadcast model. Rent a moment of someone's attention during a scheduled program, deliver a message, hope it sticks. The transaction was crude. A television commercial reached millions, but could not verify whether any single viewer was watching, processing, or simply making tea. What the internet introduced, and what smartphones perfected, was not merely a new medium, but a new commodity class. Attention ceased to be borrowed. It became measured, priced, and traded in real-time auctions that execute faster than a human blink. Consider the infrastructure. Every scroll generates a data point. Every pause, the half-second a thumb hovers before moving on, registers as a signal of interest or disinterest, fed into recommendation algorithms whose sole optimization target is continued engagement. Platforms do not sell products to users. They sell users' behavioral patterns to advertisers. The longer someone remains on device, the more inventory becomes available. This meant the entire engineering apparatus of Silicon Valley, some of the most sophisticated mathematical talent on the planet, was redirected from solving problems to sustaining attention, not capturing it once. Engineering the habit of returning. What followed was a convergence that no single architect designed, but that multiple incentive structures produced simultaneously. Platform business models rewarded time on device and recurrent engagement. Employers, armed with the same devices, rewarded responsiveness and perceived commitment. A Slack message sent at 9 p.m. carries no explicit demand for immediate reply, and yet notification light pulses, badge count increments, and ambient awareness that a colleague is waiting generates its own gravitational pull. These two extraction regimes, commercial and professional, converge on same behavioral outcome, permanent partial attention, a state in which no moment is fully occupied by one task and no interval is fully free from all tasks. The arithmetic of this convergence deserves scrutiny. A person works 8 hours producing value for an employer. That same person then spends an additional 3 to 4 hours on a smartphone during nominal leisure, producing value for platform shareholders through engagement data, ad impressions, and behavioral prediction models. The hours are not double counted in any economic ledger. The cognitive expenditure is real. People first produce value by laboring, then produce additional value by being watched, measured, and targeted while ostensibly resting. By contrast, leisure Keynes imagined was unmonetized by design. He pictured humans freed from economic necessity, filling hours with art, philosophy, gardening, quiet pursuits of a species no longer desperate. What he could not have anticipated was an economy sophisticated enough to monetize gardening itself. Or, more precisely, to monetize 3 minutes someone spends watching a video about gardening before an algorithm redirects them towards something more engaging, more arousing, more profitable per second consumed. Here, mechanism reveals its cruelest elegance. External surveillance, over time, becomes self-surveillance. Individuals begin to preempt demands before they arrive. They check messages, not because a notification appeared, but because absence of a notification produces its own anxiety, suspicion that something might be waiting, unread, unanswered. Rest is narrated internally as negligence. A quiet afternoon triggers not relief but low hum of guilt, a sense that stillness must be justified, optimized, or at minimum documented for social media, as evidence of intentional self-care. System no longer requires overt coercion. Identity and device architecture perform compliance automatically, silently, in space between one thought and next. This is why exhaustion persists even where formal work hours remain stable. Cognitive load and attentional fragmentation rise, while uninterrupted restoration declines. Try to recall yesterday's last 30-minute stretch with no screen, no notification, no background task competing for neural bandwidth. Economic battlefield migrated from factory floor to nervous system. And nervous system, unlike a factory, has no whistle. But extraction alone does not explain final layer. Something else shifted. Something harder to quantify than screen time or engagement metrics. A cultural mutation occurred, quiet, total, that made enough socially illegible and transformed productivity from a tool into a moral performance. And just as that mutation reached its terminal form, one industry discovered how to sell cure for very disease it had. A society can possess productive capacity for leisure and still classify leisure as suspect. That is not paradox in theory. It is administrative reality under fluorescent light. Earlier mechanisms are established, efficiency gains were redirected into higher throughput, attention markets colonized nominal downtime, and smartphones converted waking minutes into extractable inventory. Institutional logic, technical architecture, cognitive consequence. Still insufficient on their own. A deeper mutation hardened between 1970s, stall, and present, fusing identity to output so completely that sufficiency became illegible. Listen to the liturgy. Grind, no days off, optimize your morning. These are not neutral descriptors of necessity, but moral imperatives. Catechism for a culture where unearned rest resembles decline. Status markers inverted. Veblen's conspicuous leisure once signaled rank. The contemporary professional class signals rank through exhaustion. This operates as enforcement, not ornament. Leaving at 5 invites suspicion less because tasks remain than because boundaries imply a self not fully annexed by the institution. Midnight replies, stacked side projects, curated fatigue on social feeds, each act ratifies the norm. I am busy functions simultaneously as confession and credential. Predictably, rest survives only in instrumental form. Sleep protocols, meditation for sharper output, retreats justified as productivity maintenance. Idleness without alibi appears, to the late capitalist gaze, as ambition failure. Keynes expected abundance to resolve economic scarcity, then force a philosophical reckoning. What is life for one's earning no longer consumes it. The first half arrived. Output per hour soared. Annual work hours fell from 2,316 in 1929 to 1,765 in 2019. Surplus accumulated as forecast. The second half was deferred, then outsourced, to firms equating presence with commitment, to platforms equating engagement with personhood, to norms equating production with worth. Under that arrangement, reduced work does not feel like liberation. It feels like erasure. The 15-hour week appears impossible, not because arithmetic fails, but because identity does. Consider the counterfactual. Standard week drops to 20 hours tomorrow, no wage cut, no hidden surcharge. Vast calendar space reappears at once. What arrives first in that vacancy, curiosity or dread? The answer exposes whether the barrier was ever merely structural. The central question is now answerable: why modern life remains exhausting despite labor-saving technology. Exhaustion is not an engineering defect. It is the equilibrium of 3 interlocking systems: economic logic that recaptures saved time as throughput, attention, infrastructure that monetizes the residue, and cultural grammar that disqualifies enough. Keynes's 15 hours became arithmetically available by the late 20th century, then institutionally recaptured, technologically fragmented, and culturally invalidated. This is structural recursion, not conspiracy. Liberation technologies repeatedly enter the same adaptive loop. Efficiency lowers effort per unit, Demand expands to absorb surplus, norms recalibrate the baseline. Washing machines raised cleanliness expectations, smartphones raised availability expectations. Generative AI will raise output expectations. The pattern is not anomaly. It is operating code. Keynes read the number aloud in Cambridge in 1930. 15. The arithmetic remained sound. The century obeyed arithmetic and ignored the prior question. Arithmetic cannot adjudicate what a civilization believes human life is for. If the hours returned tomorrow, how many would know how to inhabit them?